President Yoon is heading to Washington, D.C. on this Monday for a summit with his U.S. counterpart Joe Biden on Wednesday local time. Among the issues on the agenda during the state visit this week are those related to the economy. So what are the sticking points on the bilateral economic front? Is economic security a feasible venture for the two countries? And how have Seoul's economic ties with Washington evolved over the years? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we touch upon the potential economic issues on the agenda during scheduled talks between Presidents Yoon and Biden. For this, I have Professor Kang Tae-soo from KAIST with me in the studio. Professor Kang, thank you for being here.
Thanks for inviting me.
I also have Mark Tokola, Vice President of the Korea Economic Institute of America, live on the line. Mr. Tokola, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Right, Professor Kang, we'll start here in the studio. Let's begin with your thoughts on the implications of this upcoming summit for the Korean economy.
Well, I was told this morning that this is state visit, third state visit during the Biden presidency. So that tells me that the U.S. puts tremendous importance on this Mr. Yoon's visit to U.S. So I think it has been a historic progress. I think cooperating these two countries in terms of national and economic security issues. So I think there's great momentum for both countries to reaffirm the basic principle of chorus alliance. So seems to me this should be the beneficiaries. A future generation should be the beneficiary of this very valuable relations. So I think I hope those two summits will lay the cornerstone for next 70 years of chorus alliance down the road. And implication for Korean economy is the twofold. I think as the presidential office put it correctly. So try to make for sort of a dialogue, sort of a platform for talking about their economic security, materialize which way we should go right now. So the second thing, the most important immediate pressing issues is obviously with regard to Inflation Reduction Act and also the CHIPS Science Act. So which is hugely disadvantageous to Korean firms. So this time I think we have the 122 businessmen will go there together with Mr. President. So there might be some sort of a discussion or talks, so that we expect sort of possible mutually beneficial will be there. I hope. Cross my finger on that. Thank you.
Right. And before we delve into the industrial policies of the Biden administration, Mr. Tokola, perhaps you could give us an assessment or share with us an assessment of the Seoul-Washington Economic Alliance under the Yoon administration, which looks to mark its first anniversary in office next month.
Oh, thank you. Dr. Kang mentioned there have been some issues in the press over this past year, such as the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. But if you look at the overall numbers, the U.S.-Korea economic relationship is remarkably strong. Right now, of Korea's global exports, 17.7% are heading for the United States. That's the highest number in 20 years, and compares with the 19.6% for China, so they're actually quite close. Furthermore, the U.S. is the only major Korean export market that's been increasing steadily for the past 5 years. So the relationship is very good right now. I would point to one more number. The Korean Federation of Industries did a recent poll and asked its membership what the most important countries were for Korea to partner with. And 89% of the KFI said that the United States is Korea's most important economic partner. So right now the relationship is strong.
Right. And Professor Kang, the Yoon administration, as you mentioned earlier, has highlighted the importance of economic security with the U.S. What do you believe is the importance of this initiative, economic security?
Well, as you know after war on Ukraine, there might be some dramatic changes in trade pattern and worldwide. So-called the like-minded country trade pattern among trade among like-minded countries is a new fashion, a new pattern, or new norm. So having said that, the Korea now try to reduce the overdependence from China. So in terms of global value chain point of view, so this is a momentum to try to improve their super China dependency, as well as expand their more visible possibility to U.S. So on that score, I think Korea joined the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework last year. So it could be another chance to expand their supply chain connectivity with U.S., Japan, and India, and among other 13 countries. The IPEF is composed of around 40% of the worldwide GDP, so which is quite bigger than the RCEP or as well as CPTPP, which is around 12% or 15% in the middle of that. So I think the strengthening their IPEF relationship, as well as the right way to go for revamp our economic security with the relationship with the U.S. That's the core concept, I think.
Right. Mr. Tokola, I understand this may be a general question, but what discussions do you suppose are necessary to foster economic security?
I think a good way to start would be to try to define what economic security actually means. I've not seen a strong definition of the term. So what are we actually talking about? Are we talking about meeting military requirements? Are we talking about protecting jobs? Or does it include food security? So what is economic security? I worry that all advanced economies, including the United States, might be tempted to use the term economic security to engage in some old-fashioned protectionism. And that would not be good for anybody. There's a role for government in the economy. Governments need to regulate, and governments need to promote research and development. But we've learned over time that if governments subsidize or if they protect industries, they tend to become inefficient rather than more competitive. So I think we need to be careful that we actually know what we're talking about. My preference would be for the US and South Korea to sit down and have a talk about what real economic security means. What is the requirement that actually needs to be met? And then decide what is not part of economic security so there can be competition in those areas.
And staying with that, Professor Mr. Tokola, this is an impromptu question, but what do you believe should be included in the term then economic security?
Yeah, I believe it should include high technology, dual use products that can be used for military purposes. Now, military is getting broad. I need to talk about beyond traditional definitions of military. The very highest end semiconductors will be important for dual use technology, military and commercial. So I think we need to figure out which semiconductors to promote and protect, which ones are just consumer products. We don't need to protect every US company industry from every Chinese export. And we can certainly export things to China that don't have high technology, cutting edge use. So we should narrow that list to what's really important.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, Professor Kang, as you mentioned earlier, also on the agenda with regard to broader trade talks between Seoul and Washington on Wednesday, local time, that is in the US, are the Inflation Reduction Act and the US CHIPS Act. What are the sticking points?
Okay. I think, first of all, to tell the long story short, we are in the Korean firm is not the level playing field right now, because of these hugely disadvantageous outcomes to Korea. In terms of, for instance, a couple of days ago, U.S. government announced the 7,500 subsidy for electric vehicles, but all of the Korean companies is just excluded. So let me just go by one by one for Inflation Reduction Act. There are two sort of a requirement for you to have the eligible for 7,500 subsidy. First, you have to made in U.S. Requirement. Then you should made and assemble your car in North America. The second term is more, as you said, sticking point is second point, battery requirements. So which most of the Korean companies is for sort of a big hurdle for that. So I think there's two requirements, also the battery requirements. First one, more than 50% of components of battery should be made in U.S. And the second component is rare minerals. So more than 40% of minerals should be from U.S. and also from the U.S. companies, other companies under the FTA agreement with U.S. So in that case, you could have the 7,500 subsidies eligibility. But it seems to me for instance, take for instance Hyundai Motor Company produced the Alabama GV70, Genesis whatever, but the Hyundai Motor Company GV70 satisfied the first requirement, which is made in America requirement. But now the GV70 was excluded because of the violation. I mean, doesn't satisfy with the second term of battery requirement. So I think on the other time is the act is Chip and Science Act. Chip and Science Act requires the Korean firms to share the extra profit with the U.S. government, and company has to report the very secret information, your accounting information, and the company has to ban to invest more than 10 years from the down the road to China. So this, I mean, I understand the motivation behind this IRA and Chip and Science Act is understandable because their motivation is try to reduce China's try to exclude China among this global value chain. But however, think about the allied countries is the one who victimize this type of things, So we should be very careful about this to think about this, the outcome of this ILA and Chip and Science Act. The repercussion is quite dangerous. I mean, disadvantages from the point of Korean companies. So I would say that in Korea, the Samsung Electronics invest more than $17 billion in Texas, Taylor City in Texas, right? So and also the Hyundai Motor Company invest $11 billion to Savannah City in Georgia for, and I'm expecting 8,500 new jobs there. So in response for that, what could be the reward for that? So that's a big question from Korean side of point. So I think these policy talks, I mean the summit talks, I guess these matters could be more widely discussed. So I hope the mutually beneficial way could be the outcome of these meetings.
Right, and keeping in mind what Professor Kang has just said, Mr. Tokola, do you believe Korea is likely perhaps to witness some tangible developments in its favor with regard to the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act following the summit this Wednesday in Washington, D.C.?
I think there may be some room for some slight modifications or some different means of implementation. But I think the most important point is that after 8 months of experience now with these two pieces of legislation, we're beginning to learn that although Korean auto manufacturers took some short-term disadvantages from the CHIPS and IRA acts, in the long term, Korea is going to benefit hugely from both acts. And we're starting to see how that's going to happen. For example, the CHIPS Act provides $280 billion worth of funding over 10 years. $52 billion of that is to promote domestic manufacturing of semiconductors in the United States, but the vast majority of it, $200 billion, is for research and development and commercialization. And that fund, Korean companies will benefit from directly. The Taiwanese market research firm Trend Force looked into it, and their report, which came out fairly recently, said that Samsung is going to be a huge beneficiary of the CHIPS Act. Now, those are the terms they used. Say Samsung will hugely benefit. When it comes to the IRA and the effect on batteries and cars, the eventual impact is going to be to make sure that American automobiles have Korean batteries in them rather than Chinese batteries. And that strikes me as a good thing. With the investment going on now with the Korean LG and SK companies in battery manufacturing in the States, they're going to be part of the system that's going to benefit from the act. So some analysts have estimated that LG and SK and other Korean battery firms are going to receive $14.5 billion in tax benefits, from the IRA. So the short term, I can see the problems, and they should have been avoided. Long term, I think Korea is going to do very well from both these acts.
Right, hopefully you're right then. Beyond bilateral trade, Professor Kang, the Bank of Korea, would you like to add something, Professor Kang, to what Mr. Tokola has just said? Of course.
Mark's point is quite great, you know. So I guess I was wondering that I read each and every articles and this morning columns and everything, you know, this morning for preparing for this, you know. But I haven't heard anything about that Mark just pointed out. So I think this is a very critical point here. So why should some sort of a chance to let Korean people know about this, you know, positive side of Inflation Reduction Act and Chip and Science Act? So we don't know the other side of the coin yet. So that's the big problem here. So I would recognize listening to Mark's point.
Right, a very valid point. We've raised quite a bit of concern about these industrial policies, and perhaps we need to focus a little bit also on the potential long-term gains that these policies may result for Korean companies as well, as pointed out by Mr. Tokola. And now, Professor Kang, the Bank of Korea here on the local front has left its benchmark interest rate unchanged for 2 straight sessions. What are your prospects with regard to the Federal Reserve's rate policy moving forward, and how should Korea perhaps seek to better respond to it?
Well, I think I was told the Federal Reserve is trying to dithering, you know, to thinking about second thought about the rate speed, you know, rate high speed after the Silicon Valley Bank fallout, and bankruptcy of the bank is a big news in the U.S. So market just tried to put pressure to give some pressure to the Federal Reserve to speed speed down, you know, slow down the rate hike. But think about it this way, you know, the U.S. March inflation is 5% right now, but their inflation target is 2% yet. So a long way to go right now. So it seems to me the Federal Jay Powell doesn't stop his accelerator right now for the time being. So back in the U.S. history, you can realize the importance of this point of the monetary policy. Back in 1980s, you know, the Federal Reserve has experienced that lowering down from inflation from 15% to 4% by raising interest rate from 10% to 20%. This is the U.S. central bank interest rate. So then, Jay Powell keep talking about this importance of this aggressiveness, you know, to lowering down the inflation. So having said that, you know, the Korea point of view, Korea's March inflation is 4.2%. The benchmark rate is 3.5%. So there's a 1.5 percentage point of gap between the U.S. interest rate is higher than Korea. So obviously we are worried about capital flight, you know, the capital outflows right now. So we don't have any yet specifically big amount of chunk of money of outflows right now. But so that's a bottom line, also the headache for Bank of Korea. So it seems to me it all depends on their policy pivot by the Federal Reserve, and then just try to follow the Bank of Korea has to looking very carefully about the movements in U.S. first of all, and even if so, I think these two, as you correctly point out right now. So they Bank of Korea just stop right now and looking for foggy days out there. So try to waiting for the foggy is wiped out a little bit. So that's the point right now. So that my understanding is that on that monetary policy point.
They seem to be taking a wait-and-see approach then. Meanwhile, Mr. Tokola, the U.S. and South Korea, of course, celebrate 70 years of ties this particular year. What are some of the most tangible changes in the bilateral economic landscape, do you suppose, over those 7 decades?
That is a very big question.
It is, it really is.
Covers a lot of time. I think everyone knows, or almost everyone knows, the success story of South Korea. In 70 years, South Korea has gone from being one of the world's poorest countries, with a GDP below that of Haiti in 1953, to being one of the world's top 10 economies. That's one of the great success stories of the past 100 years, and it's something to celebrate. From the other side of the equation, I think it's worth noting that the U.S. was the world's #1 economy in 1953, and is the world's #1 economy this year. So in 70 years, the United States has held its position. That's quite remarkable, I think. For 50 years, I've been reading articles about the decline of the United States, but it never actually seems to happen. The U.S. has proven to be very resilient. So the relationship between Korea and the United States has gone from donor and donee to a dynamic, mature partnership that has a global impact. So it's utterly transformed. What we're living with now is the consequences of our success. You know, because we've done well for the past 70 years, I think we're in much better shape to be able to deal with challenges we're facing now for the future. We haven't solved every problem. We've got climate change, we have adapting to high technology, we have economic security, issues we need to deal with. But because of the last 70 years' success, we're in a strong position to deal with future challenges.
Right, hopefully we are. And staying with the problems that we need to tackle, Professor Kang, given the current geopolitical developments, pundits here have been calling on South Korea to seek a balanced approach to its security ties with the US and, of course, its economic ties with China. What do you say?
Well, I guess that's a tricky question and very, very, very important question to me, as well as to other fellow Koreans. Well, it seems to me the answer is already from US. You should take a look at from National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan with his co-author Kurt Campbell in 2019. He wrote a paper I read, Competition Without Catastrophe: How America Can Both Challenge and Coexist with China. So the point is this, you know, U.S.'s position to dealing with China is to try to coexistence at steady state. So in terms of U.S. tries to expand the mutually coordination with, for instance, climate changes and also pandemic areas. So they try to seeking some sort of a touching point for mutual cooperation. So furthermore, I think in case in Korea, you know, the China is still a very big market, and our number one export country still right now. And I think most of productions is concentrated in China, along with Vietnam and in India. So I think of course, this is very important to reduce the too much excessive China dependency. But wiping out the China global supply chain, wiping out 100% is impossible. So for instance, in case in US, you know, Apple, NVIDIA, as well as the Tesla, they still have their China production site in China. So still they try to retain their China supply chain right now. So I think seems to me as you put it, Pundit told me that right now he summarized like this. Right now China market is without US. No. And U.S. is sort of a market as without China. So both of us sort of a challenging an opportunity for both Korea. So again, the balanced approach is quite critical right now. So I think it seems to me too much. I think that is also I understand Janet Yellen, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, is trying to visit China these days. You know, so I think seems to me I think that's the right way to go. So there isn't any sort of pushing the China more edge way. Then that's not a good way of thinking or policy playing around. So that's my opinions.
Right, Mr. Tokola, what meanwhile are your prospects of this planned summit, especially with regard to the bilateral economic venture between, of course, South Korea and the U.S.?
Okay, I'll get to that. Let me say a word about China first, too. I'd just like to agree with Dr. Kang in that we're all dependent on China. You know, when people say that South Korea is dependent on China, but the U.S. is less so, it's not true. The U.S. is just as dependent on China. If we didn't have Chinese trade and Chinese markets and Chinese imports, the U.S. would be in a depression. So we're both dealing with the same issue. South Korea and the United States need to find a way to manage the risk of dealing with China, to try to lower the risk, but we're not going to disengage. There's no decoupling. That's not going to happen. So we face the same challenge. We can talk about that together. That will be a topic for the summit. I think it's important to remember the last two summits have done a great job in constructing a very large economic agenda already for the U.S.-Korea relationship. So I'm not sure how much can be added to that. I think we will talk about climate change and supply chain resiliency. But in the summit coming up, I think the headlines are going to be about the extended deterrence issues.
Right,
I
and
think
with
dealing with
Korea's
that's going to be the headlines for the
belligerence,
issues
of
this
course.
time,
Right.
rather than economics. That does not mean economics is unimportant. It just means you've come a long way on the economic agenda.
Right, a valid point right there. All right, Mr.
Yeah.
Tokola, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. And Professor Kang here in the studio, thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Right, well, that ends Monday's edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. Do join us again same time tomorrow. That is Tuesday.